Hi everyone. Welcome back to the session. In this session, we are going to move forward with the basic authentication we set up in our previous lecture. I am in the previous code where we left. So just to repeat what we did in our previous session, we secured all our downstream services. Plus, we secured our configuration server as well as Eureka server, which is our discovery service. And then the API gateway was open, so anyone can send a request to API gateway. And then what API gateway was doing is sending the credentials to the downstream services. And these credentials are hard coded in the application properties. So this was our previous setup. Now we will move forward and make it a little more generic and more robust. So in this one, we are going to secure our API gateway as well. So then all our services are going to be secure using the Spring Security. After that, what we are going to do is the user has to send a request through API gateway, and then API gateway is secure, so the user or the request will have credentials for the API gateway. API gateway is going to authenticate, and if authentication is successful, API gateway will pass the request to the downstream services with the credentials for the downstream services. The credentials for downstream services will only be known to the API gateway. So the user has to send only one credential all the time, irrespective of what service the user wants to use. So for instance, if user wants to use a course service or a student service, the request will always have the credentials for the API gateway only. And then later on, API gateway will pass the right credentials for the respective service. Secondly, API gateway will also pass a secret header to the downstream service. This will make our downstream services more secure, because if somebody already knows the credentials for the downstream services, but they don't know the secret header, they will still not be able to get a response from the downstream service. So this is the whole idea, what we are going to implement now. So what we need, the first thing is we need a authentication service, and we need two endpoints. One is sign up for a new user who wants to sign up with a username and password. Second is the authentication. Authentication is if we send a credential, and authentication service is going to tell us if the credentials are okay or not. There is no security to hit the authentication service, because anyone should be able to hit the authentication service and create their sign up. Secondly, we are going to add routing in the API gateway for the authentication service. So if we look at the code, and if we go in our API gateway configuration, we have routing added for course, enrollment, and student. We are going to add routing for the authentication service. After that, we will add a security filter in the API gateway, which is going to allow every request to pass through. Because if we don't allow every request to pass through, the API gateway is going to return with the unauthorized status, which is 401. So then what will happen is when somebody sends a request and it hits the API gateway will allow everything. And then if the request is for authentication service, that will just pass on without any security. But if the request is for any other downstream service, then we are going to manually authenticate the request. And that's why we want to allow API gateway to pass it so that the authentication can be done later and API gateway itself does not try to authenticate. For example, here what is happening here is, before, what we did in our previous lecture is we send the authentication to the downstream services, and the downstream services were doing the basic authentication automatically. There was no code added in the downstream services explicitly for the authentication. So once we send this from here, and if we go in the core service, you will see in the core service we don't have any specific authentication done. It's just that in our core service we have added the Spring Security username and password, and the authentication was done automatically, which we are going to stop. So for that, we are going to tell API gateway to not do basic authentication as well as not show the login dialog. After that, what all we have done is we have allowed the auth endpoints to pass through. When a request comes to the API gateway, the credentials are going to come in the headers. So API gateway is going to take out the header, get the username and password, send the request to the authentication service for checking the authentication. If authentication service says it's not authenticated, so we are going to return 401 unauthorized. And if authentication service says that credentials are matching, then we will go ahead and pass that request to the downstream service. Then what the API gateway is going to do is it is going to add the credentials in the request. So let's say the request is for the course service. The API gateway is going to add course service credentials in the request, plus it is going to add a secret header as well in the request and pass that request to the course service. In the core service, we are going to implement a custom filter where the core service is going to fetch the headers, check for the secret header, and if it matches, it pass on to validate the credentials. And then once everything is fine, the request reaches the controller, and rest of the things are done as before, and the core service returns, and then the request is returned to the caller. So this is the whole idea and the flow we are going to implement. So the first thing we need is, let's go in the API gateway and remove our code which is sending the authorization, because now we don't want this. We are going to manually authenticate. So let's remove it. So our code will look something like this. After that, we are going to create a authentication service. So for that, I'm going to go on Spring Initializer and create a basic authentication service. I am going to select Java Maven 3.5.6 and I will say cu.college.authentication service, and I'm going to generate. Let's go back to Visual Code. So let's do the routing for this service. So I am going to say Auth Service, and that's it. So we added a authentication service route as well in our API gateway. I think at this time, this is all we need to change in the API gateway config. We are going to add more code later. At this time, this is all good. Now let's open our auth service, and I'm just going to delete unnecessary things to make our code look less cluttered. So I'm just kept src and pom.xml for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I have created a database in MySQL, and which is userdb. And if I say select star from users, I have one row added, username, user email, and password, which is 64-bit encoded value. We are going to look how we are going to pass this thing into our DB. So the DB table has only 3 columns. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, for now, I'm just going to delete it. Let's go back to VS Code. Let's start working on the auth service. So I'm going to go here. The first thing I'm going to do is add this to our configuration server. So I have this already created an application properties file. I'm going to just paste it here. So this is how my auth service.properties look. It is going to run on server port 9005. Rest of the properties I think you are pretty much aware of. And then in my auth service application properties, I am just going to add a couple of. In my application properties for the auth service, I have added the configuration server credentials and the URL for the configuration servers and the application name. After that, I'm going to go in my pom.xml and check a few things. So I'm going to change it to 3.5.3 because that is the configuration which is working for me and I don't want to change it. Other than that, in my auth service, I want to integrate it with the configuration server. So I'm going to add a dependency for the configuration server, and I will say it's config client, and I will want to integrate it with the Eureka server. So I will add a Eureka client properties as well. So this is my final pom.xml looks like. Let's move on. Now what we are going to do is, let's create a few folders or directories in my auth service. So I'm going to create a few folders. Config. Okay, so let's start with the DTO first. Now what I'm going to do is, the request I'm going to get is, I will call it a sign up DTO, and which will have 3 properties: email, which is going to be unique, password, and the username. So username is possible that it's not unique, but email has to be unique. This is my, let's say I will call it sign up DTO. Then the second is authentication DTO, when a service wants to authenticate. So that will have only 2 properties, an email and password. And the third one is, I will call it return DTO, which is going to send a couple of things. So let's say somebody wants to sign up, and the return DTO is going to send a status as well as the email. So somebody wants to sign up. If sign up is successful, so the return DTO will send sign up was successful and the email on which the sign up was done. So I am going to create these three DTOs, which I have already done. So this one is my sign up DTO. I paste it here. So you see there is an email, password, and name. And then I have some basic getters, setters, and my constructor. Similarly, I have a authentication DTO, which looks like this: email and password. So somebody wants to authenticate with authentication servers. They are going to send an email and password, and then this is the basic DTO. And then the third one is return DTO, which looks like this, which has an email and status, and then rest of the bits. Then similarly, I have a model DTO, model class, which is user.java, and this looks like this, which has a username, password, and I will change it to email instead of username. Save it. So our basic data structure is set up. Now let's start with the lowest level. First, I'm going to just set up my authentication service application, and I will say maybe discovery client. Then the second thing is I will just add component scan. So this is ComNCU college Auth Service. And what else I want to do? So our basic application is fine. Now let's start with the repository layer. So I am going to create a new Java file called auth repository, new Java class, and I will call it auth service repository. I will call it, add a repository annotation, give it a value auth repository. Then I am going to add a JDBC template here and add a constructor which injects JDBC template, add an import for the JDBC template. Now we need a couple of functions. The first one is sign up, and this is going to take sign up DTO, which I will just call credential, and a string buffer for the status. Now what I need is I need a query which is going to insert my sign up DTO, which has username, password, and email. So my query is looking like this, and then I'm sending JDBC update. I will put that in a try catch block and exception, and I'm going to, if there is an exception, I'm going to append the error, and which is going to pass to the service layer. And then I'm going to log it also on console and return false. If everything goes fine, I'm going to return true. I think this is all. Now I need another method for the authentication, and which is public boolean get password from email. Okay, so the function will take an email and is going to return a password string buffer, and then my query will look something like, and I'm going to call JDBC query for object, the query, and then the string. It is going to return a string and will pass the email. So for email, I am going to get the password, and this password is going to be returned to the caller. So I am going to just append this in the password variable, and I'm going to put a try catch again here. So if all goes well, it will return true, and otherwise there will be an error, and error will be appended to the error which is passed by the caller. Okay, so I think our repository layer is fine. We just need two functions. Then let's go to our service layer, and I'm going to add a Java class here called Auth Service.java, and then let's write the same things in this one also. So now what I need is I need my repository, auth repository here, and I need a password encoder which is going to encode my password into the 64-bit encoding. So I have added these two. Okay, then I'm going to add a constructor here. So in the constructor, I am injecting auth repository as well as the password encoder. So to inject a password encoder, I need to create it in a config class. Need to create a bean for that, which is going to return the password encoder. So what I am going to do is, I have already created the config class here. I'm just going to paste it here. So if you see, I created a configuration class and created a bean, which is returning the bcrypt password encoder. Okay, and so then we will be able to inject it in our service layer here. Okay, that's how you inject. I think I have shown this before as well, how you inject some of the classes which are not bean. Okay, let's go back to the service, and then I need two functions. One is sign up and one is authentication. So my sign up is going to look like this. In the sign up, I am getting a sign up DTO and the response, which I am going to return to the controller. Okay, now what I need to do is, in my sign up, I am getting three things: an email, a password, and a user. The password is plain text. I need to convert it into the base 64 encoding using the password encoder. So what I am doing is, I am using the password encoder to encode the password, and again setting the same password which is encoded in the thread. Okay, I'm going to create a string buffer to get the status, and then I'm going to call the repository for the sign up. So thread is all set up. It has a username, an email, a user, and the password which is 64-bit encoded, and the status which it is going to return. So if the success, if let's say I get is success, then I am going to do something. Otherwise, I am going to return. Now, if everything goes fine, what I'm going to do is I am going to set the response. Okay, so which is going to go in this. Okay, so response set status is this, and then later on, if I get an error, I am going to set a different response, and then I am going to, so which means the response which is sent to the caller will have two things: a status, either it could be successful or failed, and if it is failed, the status which is coming from the repository layer is also attached. So if you see in the repository layer, I am sending this error in catch from the exception, which is going here, and it is reaching in service here, here status, and then that status is attached. So let's say our database is not working, so the error will be user registration failed, DB not found, something like that. And then the second thing will be the email, so that the user knows that for what email the user came. Okay, so this is pretty much straight. And then I am going to, so this is my sign up, looks good. Then I need another method, authenticate. And what I need to do is, in my authentication, I am getting an email and password. And what I need to do is, so let's take out the email and password coming in the, and now what I need to do is, I need to take out the password for this email and match that password with the password I am getting in the request. Okay. So I am going to call my repository layer, the function get password from. So I'm going to send it password from DB and call get password from email. I will get a status. I will get the password from the DB for this email. And then I am going to decode this because the password is encoded inside the DB. I am going to decode this password and match that password which I am getting in the thread. So I wrote this, which is decoding and matching here. If all goes well, it returns true, which means authentication was successful. Otherwise, it is going to return. So our service layer is done. Let's go one level up into our controller. So I'm going to say new Java file. The same thing will go here. Now here I need to inject my authorization auth service. So I'm going to do this, and I will call it REST controller, and the mapping will be from auth. Okay. Now I'm going to inject auth service in the constructor and going to write two functions. One is sign up and the other will be, now in the sign up, what I need to do is I need to call the auth service and the sign up method. So I'm getting a sign up DTO and I'm going to return the return DTO. Okay. So I'm going to create a return DTO object here and call the service layer for the sign up. If is success, which means all good, what I need to do is I need to return response entity.ok. Otherwise, I need to return response entity and set a status, let's say bad request. And then in the body, I will attach the response. So in this case, the response will be sign up failed with the more detailed information plus the email of the user. Here it will be sign up successful and the email. Okay. Now let's write the authentication code. So this will be like same. I'm going to call the auth service for the authentication. I'm getting the credentials. So it will send the username and password, and username is email. If all goes good, authenticated will return true and I will return status okay. Otherwise, I am going to return authentication fail and unauthorized status. So that's how our authentication service looks like. This is looks to be working fine. I think this is all we wanted. I have a configuration here. I have a controller here. Our DTO are fine. Model repository service and this and the application properties, which is going to connect with the configuration server. Okay, so let's test our authentication service once before moving forward. So what I'm going to do is I am actually going to call the authentication service directly to test it and not through the API gateway. So let's run the configuration server. Configuration server is running. Let's run the auth service. If all goes well, this should be running on 9005, and which mean auth service is able to connect with the configuration server. Okay, so auth service is running on port 9005, which means it was able to connect with the configuration server. We are seeing some stack trace because I did not run Eureka server and my auth service is not able to register with the Eureka server. So now let's try to call the signup method. I have already created a request. Just going to, so I have sign up here. So I'm going to sign up and I'm going to send the request to 9005 auth sign up, email, username, user and password, and then the content type and this. There is no security applied on the auth endpoints because we want anyone should be able to hit the authentication endpoints. So it should be pretty much straight, and we see we get a response. So sign up is done and we get a return DTO which had a status and email. Okay, let's go in MySQL and see. So you see we had a this, and the password is 64-bit encoded. Okay, now let's say I want to authenticate this thing. So let's go authenticate. So I just want to authenticate, directly call the the service on port 9005, and I will send an email and password, and let's see what we get. So it says authentication successful. If I, let's say, change it Naveen1 and send it, we get a authentication failed and status code is 401, which is unauthorized. So our authentication service is working fine. We tested both the endpoints. I'm going to just stop the service. Okay. Now this is all good. What we need to do is we need to now, the next step is make changes to the API gateway and keep the authentication endpoints open, and rest of the endpoints should also be open. But if it's anything other than authentication endpoints, they need to be authenticated. Okay, so let's make some changes in the authentication in the API gateway. Auth service is fine. Configuration server should be fine. We don't need to make any changes to the core service at this point, and create let's change our gateway config first. So we added routes. This is all good. We want a security filter here. Okay. So okay, we can remove these because now we are not authenticating here. So the authentication factory we added before can be removed. Okay, so I am going to remove it, and okay, so I will say bean and public security web filter chain and I will call it Spring Security Filter Chain and server HTTP. So remember, when we are in API gateway, we need to use server HTTP security. But in our downstream services, we need to use HTTP security. These two security classes, maybe you need to read a little more how they are different and why we need different security modules in API gateway and in our downstream services. So this is okay. I will just now, what I'm going to do is HTTP. I think I have explained this in my previous video that we want to disable the cross-site forgery because we don't need it. This is needed in browsers. That is the first thing. Then I will say authorize exchange and exchange, and then I will say path matchers. So anything coming from auth should be allowed, permit all. Okay, any other should be permit all as well, but I have just differentiated, and we will see what we are actually going to do in our custom filter. Okay, that's it. Next, I am going to say HTTP basic, and we are going to disable the basic authentication because now we are not sending the credentials in here. Before we were doing that here, we were sending the credentials and setting the credentials in the route, which we are not doing. So we are not using the Spring Security to authenticate, and that's why we are disabling it. Secondly, we are also disabling the login form. So we don't want to see the login form. And then I will say HTTP build. So that's it, and I'm going to return it. Okay, so this looks okay to me. We have allowed auth and we have allowed other also, for example course module and anything else. Okay, so this is fine. I am going to add webflux here, security. Now what else we need to do? We need to write a global filter now, which is going to do most of our work, and you need to understand it. Okay, so I am going to say new Java file. I will say this is a component. Now here, what we need to do? Let's start slow and add a filter here, and I am going to derive, I'm going to implement. So this is the first thing I need to implement from the interface. And the second thing which needs to be implemented is get order. So why this we are going to implement and tell I'm going to return -1, which means that I want this filter to run before any other filter. Okay, what are actually filters? Filters are when your service runs, this code is run before anything else is executing in your service, so that you can take decisions. For example, you want to authenticate anything, you want to do let's say pass this request to any other service. Okay, so all these decisions are taken in the filter. As we write filter, you will have some better understanding of what a filter do. So the first thing we want to do is, if anything comes for authentication, we are not going to do anything. Okay, so what this code is doing, this code is saying we are going to take out the request. Okay, so I have taken the request and taken the path. Now if the path is starting with auth, if the path is starting with auth, I'm not going to do anything, and I'm just going to call the next filter in the chain, which means how my chain is designed. So somebody sends a request to the authentication service from the API gateway. So the first hit is on the API gateway. Okay, and the second hit is going to be on the authentication service. So in that chain, the first filter is the API gateway filter, and the next filter is the authentication service filter. Okay, so when I'm not doing anything and I'm saying pass this request to the next filter in the chain, it is going to go to the authentication service. Okay, so that's how the chain of filters work, one after the other. Let's say authentication service has to pass this request to any other service, so then the next filter in the chain will be that service. Okay, so we are not going to do anything with authentication, just pass it to the next filter in the chain. Otherwise, I am going to extract the header. So that's how I am going to extract the header to check for the credentials. Okay, next, if the header is null or it does not start with basic, I am just going to return and say unauthorized. So if the header is null or it does not start with basic, okay, which means, let me show you how the header should look like. So authentication is fine, but let's say I want courses. Okay, so the courses header should look like this. Name should be authorization. It should start with basic, and this is the base 64 base 64 encoding. Okay, how you can do base 64 encoding? If you have Notepad++ installed, go to Notepad++. Let's say I want this in this format. Let me show you. The authentication is look like this: basic, and then your username, which is naveen@gmail.com, and then colon, and then my password. And this whole string, including colon, has to be converted to base 64. Okay, this you can do is paste this in Notepad++ and go to plugins, MIME tools, and say base 64 encode with padding. Select this text and then select base 64 encode with padding, and you are going to get this string. So I am taking out the authorization header in this code, and if should start with basic, and if it's starting with basic, all is good. Otherwise, I am going to return, okay, and say unauthorized. Next, I am taking out basic from it and take out the username and password. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is take out basic. For the rest of the string, I am going to decode it. So I am decoding it. This should be this. Okay, and then after decoding, I am going to take out username and password from it. So username and password is taken out. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I am going to call the authentication service to validate it. Okay, so I'm going to create a auth DTO from it. Okay, and for this auth DTO, which is in our authentication service, but because I also need auth DTO here, I am going to make a copy in my API gateway as well. So I'm going to create a folder and DTO and then paste it here. Okay, save it. I go here, it should be able to do it. Okay. Okay, auth DTO looks fine. Now I need to create a web client. So I create a web client here. Now I need to create a bean for this web client. So I'm going to go in my gateway config and create a web client bean here. Like we'll add the next. I am going to call this, call my service. So that's how you are going to call the service. So if you see in our gateway config, that's how it looks like, auth service. And I'm going to call LB auth service auth authenticate. Okay, and I am in the body, I am sending the auth DTO, which has username and password, and that's it. And after that, how I am going to retrieve, I am going to retrieve like, and if it's successful, we are going to do something. Otherwise, if it's not successful, I am just going to return unauthorized. And on error also, I am going to return unauthorized. And I'm going to create a function for unauthorized, which is going to create a response for the unauthorized. This looks okay. Now what I am going to do here is, if everything is fine, a request is authorized, then I need to pass it to the downstream service. So for example, from API gateway, the request has to go to the core service. So what I need is, I need to create a route, and from the request, I need to take out the route value, and from the route value, I need to take out the ID of the route. So the ID is going to be this. If we go again in the gateway config, so the ID is, these are the IDs for the route. I am going to take out core service. Okay, and then I am going to send this core service to our auth header factory, which will create a core service credentials. So for, if I'm getting core service in build auth header, the username and password will be set for the course username and password, which are coming from my configuration file. Okay, and then these are encoded. So these are encoded basic plus I just showed you username colon password, and these are base64 encoded and added to, concatenated with the basic. So this is what my auth header factory is doing, and it is returning it. Okay, so that thing I have to do here. So I get the route ID, and from route ID, I am going to create a request, and so I'm going to mutate the request and add a header which will have my credentials, which I just said. So I'm going to add an authorization header, and here I am going to get the basic and then space and then base64 encoded username and password. After that, I am going to send a secret header. Okay, so this is my secret header, which I am going to define in my application properties. So if we go in my API gateway application properties in the configuration server, let's go in configuration server, resources, config API gateway. Here I am going to define a secret. Okay, and this secret will be sent to the downstream services to be verified. So come back to the global filter. The name of the header is this, and the value is coming from auth factory get shared secret. And if I go in the auth factory, I'm just going to create a function which will return me the value of this secret. So let's add it at the top, this, and add a function get secret. This I am doing in the auth header factory, and then go here, and when I call auth factory get shared secret, I am going to get the, so I am sending two values in the header. One is the credentials and one is the secret. Okay, and that's it. Build it. After building, I am calling the next chain with this request, and the next chain is core service. So this all mutated request is going to go to the core service. We got a request in the API gateway which has credentials in the header. API gateway verified those credentials by sending the credentials to the authentication service and the authenticate endpoint. If the credentials are successfully authenticated here, then what actually API gateway does is it mutate the request by adding the credentials for the downstream service. So in case it's a core service, what it is doing is it is getting the route and the route ID, and route ID is these. So let's say it's core service, so then the route ID is core service, and it gets the core service route ID. It sends that core service string to the auth header factory. What it does is it creates, depending on what it is getting, if it is getting core service, it adds the core service username and password and creates a basic authentication header by encoding it in 64-bit encoding, and returns to the global filter. Then global filter adds that to the header, as well as it edits the secret in the header. The secret is defined in the API gateway properties file in the configuration server. So if we go here, resources config API gateway, and this is the secret header which is also added, and then the same secret is going to be added in the core service and all other downstream services, which we will see in a moment. So after that, it is adding the secret, it is building, and then it is sending the request to the next filter. So because the next filter is going to be the core service, because API gateway is going to route the request to the core service. So by default, the next filter in the chain is going to be the core service, and that request is going to be sent to the core service. So you see how we changed, how we got the header, verified it, and then changed the header accordingly based on where we want to send the request to the downstream service. Let's just look at it, fix the errors which we are seeing, because we did not define the web client and the auth factory here. So we defined them, and then we are going to inject them in the constructor here. Okay, this looks fine. Let's go down here and see what the problem is. Okay, we have defined the web client and the auth header factory and injected it in the constructor. So the errors are gone. The last step which we need to do is add a custom filter in the downstream services to handle the secret header which is being sent from the API gateway. So let's go to the core service first. I am going to show that, and you can follow the same code in all of your services. So here I have the application config already working. I will add a core service filter here. So I will say class, and in the core service filter, I am going to once per request filter. Okay. So you see, in your downstream services, you are going to extend once per request filter, but in your gateway, you are implementing global filter. That's how these are different. And here what we are going to do is we are just going to validate the secret. Put the value of the secret here, and the same will be defined in the configuration for the core service. So let's go here. So then this should match the one defined in the API gateway. Okay. In real scenarios, these should not be defined in configuration files. These should be coming from database or somewhere. Maybe you have a vault implemented so that these are more secure and should not be leaked. Let's go back to the core service filter. And I am going to implement do filter internal here. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I am going to get the header, match the value of header with what is defined in the application properties, okay, which is this one. So the one coming in header will be matched with this. If all goes well, we are going to call the filter, the next filter in the chain, and which is going to be the controller for the core service. Okay. Otherwise, it is going to return and say unauthorized. Okay. So I think that is all I need to do in core service. Maybe we can try running these services and see how it goes. I am going to start with configuration server. Okay, configuration server is running. After that, we are going to run service discovery. After running service discovery, we are going to run API gateway, authentication service, and core service. Service discovery is running. Let's run the API gateway. In the meantime, I am going to go in browser and run Eureka and see if my services are able to. Okay, so there is a security on the discovery service. I'm going to just copy username and password, sign in. So API gateway is registered. Next, I am going to run my authentication service. Authentication server service is registered. And the next I'm going to run is core service. Core service is running. Refresh and we see core service. Okay. Now let's go to the HTTP client and send a request. So I am going to open API calls and get courses. So what I'm setting is my gateway is running on 9004. You can see. So I am sending get all courses. This is my authorization header and basic and the base 64 encoding for the username :password and content type is application JSON. And let's see. And see, we are able to run. Now let's say I want to try and send the request directly through the browser. I didn't get any response. Okay, let's try to hit the core service directly. So the core service is running on port 9001. Let's see what we get. If I say, so it will ask for username and password. And let's say somehow I know the username and password. Okay. So this is my core service and username and password is core service. So, and that's it. I won't get anything. It says 401 unauthorized, because even if I know the credentials, I was not able to send the secret header, and so I will not get any response. So this is how the authentication and basic authentication works, where all our services are secured. The only thing here which is not good is that we need to send the credentials every time we want to send a request. So that's a extra hit on the authentication service and then later on the DB. So this is going to slow down every request because we are hitting the authentication service with every request. And this we are going to fix by implementing token-based authentication in our next session. So for now, this is all I wanted to show. Now follow this video. This is a little advanced stuff, so I recommend you watch the video a few times. Go slow, try to understand the concepts. Let's say what are filters, how they work, what filter goes where. Okay, and try to implement all this in your services and make it work. Okay, then in our next session we are going to, so now our base is ready. We are going to change this basic authentication into a token based authentication. So I'm going to end this session here and we'll see you in the next session. Bye for now, and thanks for watching.